Biographical information for tonight's speaker is in the program at your seat, as well as the Brandt Foundation's website at boisestate.edu. But I presume you're here tonight to hear not biography, but ideas, so my intro will be short. Jason Brennan is a Flanagan Family Chair and Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethic, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He is the author of over 50 scholarly articles and book chapters, and has authored or co-authored numerous books, including Markets Without Limits, The Ethics of Voting, A Brief History of Liberty, Against Democracy, and the book whose title is this evening's topic, Why Not Capitalism? He also occasionally blogs at Bleeding Heart Libertarians. His books are noted for their conversational style and his focus on how moral positions should be judged in terms of both their desirability and their feasibility. The purpose of the Brandt Foundation Lecture Series is to bring to Idaho those who are making important contributions to a public understanding of the foundations of a free and prosperous society, and Jason Brennan is one such contributor. The Brandt Foundation Lecture Series is honored to present tonight's speaker, Jason Brennan, and his topic, Why Not Capitalism? Please welcome Jason.
Thank you very much for coming and spending this evening with me. It's really great to be here tonight and to talk to all of you. And basically what I want to talk to you today about is Mickey Mouse. All right, so if you're Mickey Mouse fans, you're in for a treat, and otherwise, not as much. Can you guys call up the slides over in the control booth for me? All right, so I'm going to start by talking about Michael Moore's book, Capitalism, a Love Story. I'm sorry, it's the movie Capitalism, a Love Story. Michael Moore spends about 127 minutes complaining about the evils of capitalism, and he says, capitalism is evil, and you can't reform evil or regulate evil. You have to replace evil with something that's not evil, and that is economic democracy. So even after 127 minutes of complaining about capitalism with maybe a little bit of hyperbole here and there, he doesn't just come out and say, we should be socialist. He uses a different word, democracy, even though what he actually means is socialism, collective control of the means of production. So why not? Why doesn't he just say, let's be socialist? I think he knows something about his audience. I think he knows that his audience subscribes to a common story about what happened in the 20th century. And the story goes something like this. In the 20th century, we divided the world in two, and we experimented with two fundamentally different ways of running the economy. The market-based societies, Denmark, Japan, Australia, Canada, Switzerland, and South Korea, became rich, and even the poor there were quite rich. The communist societies or socialist societies, Cambodia and China and Vietnam and so on, didn't become rich, and even the proletariat didn't do particularly well. And worse, the socialist societies had engaged in mass murder and all sorts of crimes against their people. So we tried communism, we tried socialism, it failed, it's over, there's nothing more to say. That's what he's worried about, and we have that story. So here's the Fraser Institute is a think tank in Canada, and every year they hire a number of economists to evaluate how kind of capitalistic or socialistic are various countries. The blue ones here are the most capitalistic. A lot of the Norwegian, like the Scandinavian countries that you all call socialist are actually quite capitalistic. They're up there in blue. And you have all the blue countries. The yellow countries are kind of like, the green countries are sort of the second tier, the yellow countries are the third tier, and the red countries are the least capitalistic. And you might notice, in general, if you think of the places you might like to live, they're probably in blue, and that's probably not an accident. So it seems like markets have been working for the most part. In fact, if you want to do like a very brief history of the world from an economic perspective, it goes something like this. 10,000 years ago, everyone, everywhere was poor. And then markets happened, and finally some people became rich. But now, over time, that richness has been spreading to everyone. So, back 50 years ago, something like 80% of the world lived in what the UN describes as extreme poverty. And now the number's down to maybe about 10%. Poverty is vanishing from our eyes as markets are spreading. Isn't that wonderful? Shouldn't we celebrate that? It's not only is it spreading, but the most capitalistic countries are also the richest countries. So what this graph is saying is that the more capitalistic you are, the richest your country tends to be. But these are just country averages. You might think, I don't care about how the average person does. I wonder about the person at the bottom 10%, the people, the least advantaged people in those societies. How do they do? It turns out they do better in capitalist societies than anywhere else. So this is looking at what do people at the 10th percentile of income at various countries make before they receive any welfare payments of any sort. And it turns out in the most capitalistic countries, the countries in blue, the person at the 10th percentile of income, as of 2011, tends to make about $11,000 a year. Now it's up to about $14,000 a year, which puts them in the top 14% of income earners in the world and means they're earning about the world average income, even though they're at the bottom of their societies. So it seems like markets are helping not just the average person, but even the relatively poor in the places where markets are allowed to be. But, that's just filthy lucre. That's just money. Who cares about that? What about other things, more important things? Well, one thing we find over around the world is that the richer countries also tend to be the healthier countries, the countries where people live longer. Money, this filthy lucre isn't just buying us stuff like better stereos, better computers. It's literally buying us more life. It also turns out it's buying us happiness. Like the richer countries and the more capitalist countries also tend to be the happier countries. So these are just some statistics, right? These are just stats about the facts. And economists agree upon these facts, and some people over in the English department, I think, probably dispute them, but these are widely accepted facts, right? But nevertheless, despite everything I've just said, I think most people, and that's not what I'm here to talk about. All that stuff, that's not the point. Despite everything I've just said, I think most people have a fundamental worry about capitalism and about markets. And that worry is that they are unsavory. That in a market-based economy, the fundamental way that we relate to one another is morally problematic. There's something bad about it. So you see lots of people, not just people on the left, but people on the right, libertarian thinkers like Milton Friedman or Adam Smith or David Hume will say the same thing. If only we were good, if we were just angels, if we were just really good people, we wouldn't need private property. We wouldn't need markets. Markets are a technology, a social technology that responds to human depravity and gets selfish people like you to behave together pretty nicely. But that's all it is. And if only we were good, we could just get rid of markets and live in a kind of socialist utopia. So that's what I want to talk about. That kind of view, you see that from all over. Lots of people push that line, not just people on the left. Nevertheless, I think the best exponent of that view is the Marxist philosopher Jerry Cohen. Jerry Cohen was a very prominent philosopher, one of the leading philosophers, period of the past 100 years. He's something called the Shelley Chair at Oxford University. And if you haven't heard of that, it's very prestigious and impressive. And before he died, the last thing he published was this little pamphlet called Why Not Socialism, with that sad little flower. And you might notice my book making fun of that. I have lots of pretty flowers, and he has one sad one. Right? Yeah, I got to design the cover. I was pretty happy about that. Right? So in this book, he's trying to convince you that deep down, all of you are already socialists. Deep down, everyone in this room is committed to the view that socialism is the best way for human beings to live. So what I'm going to do today is critique his argument, because I think the argument he's making is an argument that most people make, including libertarians and conservatives and moderates and moderate liberals, not just people on the far left. I think he's speaking to a widespread idea that there's something heavily unsavory about markets. So here's how his argument goes. All right. First of all, what are we talking about when we're talking about capitalism and socialism? We need some definitions here. So here's what I'm going to basically define them. I'm going to use the standard definitions you see in economics. A capitalist society is a society that allows private property in productive goods, in capital goods, like factories and taxi cabs and so on, things that you use to make other things and things you use to make money. You as a private individual are allowed to own that stuff, including owning it in collections with others through joint stock companies. And also, you have, as a private individual, have extensive rights to make decisions with how you will use your stuff. In contrast, a socialist society is going to be one that forbids private ownership of the means of production. Instead, all of this stuff will be held collectively, maybe through the state or in Utopia through some sort of special commune, I guess. And finally, and also, decisions about what to do in the economy will not be made by individual planners like you, but will be made by collectives through some sort of democratic process. So that's the fundamental difference between these two things. Now the question is there any reason to prefer one to the other? And what would that reason be? So Cohen, in his book, Why Not Socialism, wants to convince you of a couple claims, some moral claims and some empirical claims. The moral claim is that markets are a fundamentally unsavory, bad way for human beings to relate to one another. They are intrinsically repugnant. Further, socialism is intrinsically desirable. It's desirable as an end in itself. That's fundamentally the way we should live with one another. So there is moral claims, and his empirical claim is that there is some form of socialism that might be feasible, though he's not really sure about that at the end of the book. Right? What's his argument? Like many philosophical arguments, he relies upon thought experiments. He's not going to cite a bunch of data like I did. He's going to rely upon a thought experiment that's going to show that deep down, you are all a bunch of socialists. All right? 2 minutes from now, I'm going to have you raising your hand. You're going to see you're all socialist. Right? Here's how it goes. He says, now I, Jerry Cohen, haven't gone camping very much, but here's what I imagine it would look like if you go camping. Imagine you go on a camping trip with your friends, people you really care about, people you genuinely love. Where you have a real kind of equality and kinship and friendship. It's not like one person's cartman that you kind of exclude, but you all really care about each other. Okay? And you go on a camping trip, and when you show up, everybody brings different things. Some people bring some fishing rods, somebody brings a guitar so he can sing Oasis songs at night. Some people bring some food, people bring tents. But when we get there, because we love each other, because we care about each other, we share everything as a kind of common bounty. Everybody gets to partake. And because we love each other and care about each other, no one takes advantage of other people's generosity. Right? Further, we make sure that the chores that go into camping are split kind of equitably. Everyone kind of pitches in their fair share. We're not going to make our least fun friend have to do the dirty work, and our cool friend gets to not get out of it. We're going to make sure that everyone has an equally good time, and all the work is kind of shared equitably. He's like, that would be a really good camping trip. And frankly, I've been on some camping trips that are like that. They were pretty good. Right? I've been on some camping trips that weren't like that too, but that sounds like a good camping trip. He says, now I want you to imagine, if you think about it, what's going on in this camping trip is we're living by socialist principles of communal sharing and communal work, and it's wonderful. And now I want you to imagine that the camping trip turns capitalist. That the people, how many people know what album this is from? I'm just curious. All right, awesome, cool. It's a good album. Warrant's Dirty, Rotten, Filthy, Stinking Rich. Good 80s hair rock. Anyways, imagine that we turn capitalist. Now in the camping trip, people start behaving the way they behave in genuine capitalist societies. So for example, let's say that there's a person named Leslie, and she's really good at finding fish and catching fish. And she says to people at the camping trip, you know what guys, I'm willing to catch more fish so all of us can eat more, but only if I get out of digging latrines and doing dirty work. I don't feel like doing that. And then there's another person, let's call him Morgan. Morgan, he's really good at cracking nuts and teaching people how to gather nuts and crack them. And he's like, you know what, I'm willing to teach the rest of you at this camping trip how to crack nuts so that we all can eat more, but only if you pay me something extra. So I guess Morgan is kind of like a college professor. Yeah. I mean, we don't do this for free, right? And then now another person, let's call him Stanley. Stanley's dad had left him a well-stocked pond. He'd been there 30 years prior and left a bunch of fish in a pond, and he knows where that pond is. So at night, he goes and he catches all these extra fish, and then we're all eating at night. He has a plate just overflowing with fish, and we all have meager plates with less fish, and he just sits there and kind of gloats, ha ha, I have more fish than the rest of you. Which is kind of like the equivalent of having a Swiss watch or, some sort of fancy luxury good. So Cohen asks, would you like to go on a camping trip like that? Sounds like a crummy camping trip. So he's really going to ask you a question. He's like, if you had a choice between these two camping trips, how many of you would prefer to go on that one? What do you think? All right. And how many of you are weird sociopaths and would like to go on that trip? All right. One guy, you're probably messing with me. No, really? It's voluntary. Well, this is voluntary. No one's forcing them. They're just nice, right? Yeah. So he's like, almost everyone you ask them, they pick this trip over that trip. So you're all a bunch of socialists, he says. Voila, you're all a bunch of socialists. That's what he thinks is going on. When you have behaviors that you see in real life capitalism, you think it ruins the trip. And when you have the behaviors that are emblematic of socialism, it's wonderful. Right? So he asks the question, is there any reason why it would not be desirable to run a large-scale society like that? Now, leave aside, he says, the question of whether we can do it. I just want you to imagine I have a magic wand, and when I wave it, it will make the whole world like that. Wouldn't it be nice for me to wave the magic wand? It'd make everyone suddenly kind and sharing and loving, and no one takes advantage of everyone's generosity, and everyone does their part and feels good about it, and you don't have to force them to do it, they just do it voluntarily. Wouldn't that be nice? So he says here people get caught up on tricky questions. A question, they get stuck putting two questions together. One question is something desirable? And the other question is it feasible? And he says those things come apart. There are lots of things that are not feasible that are desirable. For instance, how many of you would like to have the Force from Star Wars? Yeah, right? I would love to have, if you could major in the Force, I would have done that. I'd love to be, I'd do the dark side too because I want to do the lightning thing, it's worth it, right? Like, I'd love to have that. However, I had a physics professor in college, Larry Krauss, and he wrote a whole book about how the Force is incompatible with our physics, so it's too bad. But nevertheless, it's desirable. Or what if I could snap my fingers and cure world hunger by doing that? Obviously I can't, but it would be wonderful if I could. So we can say it would be desirable for me to do it even though I can't. So this is what's going on with socialism. I have here a picture of the fox with the grapes. This is this old fable. And what goes on is the fox sees some grapes. He can tell, because he has a good sense of smell, that they're very tasty grapes, but he can't reach them. He jumps over and over again and can't reach them. And finally, after 45 tries, the fox goes, they're probably sour grapes anyways. The fox is making a mistake. The fact that the grapes are not attainable does not change how desirable they are. They're still really good grapes. Or to take a more complicated, silly version of that story, here's a thought experiment which I've modified a little bit from my former colleague Dave Esland. And he says, imagine we're out looking for a picnic spot together. And that's us. We're that stick figure on the far left. All right? So right now where we're standing, this is a pretty good spot. But up in the distance, on top of a hill, we can see an even better spot. The perfect picnic spot. However, it has just the right amount of sunlight and bees and shade and flowers. It's just the perfect picnic spot. But we have a few obstacles in between. First, there's a band of marauding ogres with battle axes. If we can get past them, there's a couple alligators. If we can get past them, there's a deep pit with spikes at it. If we can get past them, we have to climb up a steep hill, and you can't see it, but around that hill is this weird miasma where if you breathe it in and you're morally perfect, like I am, it has no effect. But if you're morally flawed and somewhat vicious and have some degree of human depravity, like most other people, it causes you to turn into a mass-murdering sociopath like Stalin. Right? Then, finally, if you get past that, then you're finally on top of the hill. So here's what Esland would say. He's like, we shouldn't even bother trying to get to the top of the hill because the obstacles make it impossible and it's not worth it. Nevertheless, even though we should not bother trying to get to the top of the hill, we still recognize that that hill is better than where we currently are. The top of the hill is better than our current spot. So what Cohen would say is socialism is like the top of the hill and capitalism is like where we are right now. Maybe there's some problems that make us not get there, but it's still better. Okay, so that's his argument. I think there's a mistake in his argument. I think it seems like it works, but there's a trick. And to expose the trick, what I do in my book is I literally take all 10,000 words out of his book and rewrite it, flipping it around to argue the exact opposite using the exact same argument. If you're a socialist, what I'm about to say for the next 5 minutes, you're going to think, that is completely unfair, and you're right. But I'm making the same argument he's making, so the mistake in what I'm about to say is the same mistake he makes. However, a good thing is going to happen. When you see what his mistake is and what my mistake is, and you reflect upon what it all means, I'm actually going to end with, if we were angels, we would still be capitalist. Capitalism is not only a good system for depraved, flawed human beings like us, but actually would be the right system for angels, for people who are morally perfect. You would still be capitalist, not socialist. All right, so here it goes. He had the socialist camping trip. I'm going to use the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse TV show. How many of you guys have seen that? All right, awesome. All right, so not the Clubhouse with Annette Funicello, but this cartoon. Yeah, this cartoon. All right, so Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, Clarabelle Cow, Donald Duck, Willie the Giant, Professor Von Drake, and a number of other characters live together in the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse Village. Right? It's a wonderful place where there's really nothing wrong that ever happens. Everything is good. They live under principles that are high-minded. They have communal spaces like roads and amphitheaters which seem to be owned collectively, but they also have private things that they privately own. For example, Clarabelle Cow, pictured there, is a capitalist factory owner who owns a Moo Muffin factory as well as a sundry store called the Moo Mart. Minnie Mouse, pictured there, owns a bow-making factory called the Boutique. Get it? It's cool, yeah. Where she sells bows that she manufactures for profit. Willie the Giant, pictured there, is a bourgeois landowner who owns a giant farm and sells his vegetables and things for profit. Professor Von Drake owns advanced nanotech machinery that can manufacture various goods on demand, kind of like a 3D printer, and they live together in peace and harmony and prosperity. Now, if something bad happens, like if a ball won't stop bouncing, or if Goofy Goo spills on Goofy and makes them into 5 copies, and they have to get them back together, if there's a dragon that lost its mommy, they'll all work together to overcome that problem. But they do some things privately and some things separate. And if you watch the show, there's really nothing you could complain about from a socialist standpoint. Everything goes well, even though they're living in a kind of anarcho-capitalism. Right? They live by 5 basic moral principles. Principle 1 I call the principle of moral voluntary community. They live together and they respect each other's rights, but they do so without the need for any kind of private enforcement. They don't have security people, they don't have police, they don't have law courts. They don't need it because they're so nice, there's no need for enforcement. Right? Everyone just respects one another's rights. They live under principles of mutual respect, which means that they care about each other and want to make sure everyone's rights are respected. They are tolerant of one another's differences and even celebrate their differences. They don't have a history of, say, racism or sexism, so for example, Clarabelle Cow and Goofy Dog are a thing and no one bats an eye at that. They live under principles of reciprocity. They give and expect to give in return. They help one another, and no one ever takes advantage of that. They all want to serve one another and be served in return. They live under principles of social justice, meaning that the structure of their society tends to guarantee that everybody gets what they need, and if somebody falls below the cracks, they'll just volunteer to give that person what they need. They don't need to use redistributive taxation because they're so nice they just give charitably. It's not like our world, like in Denmark, you have to force people to help each other. They just do it because they're nice. And finally, they live under principles of beneficence. They care about each other and try to help, and they never take advantage of that. It's wonderful. It's a great show. But I want you to imagine that the village became socialist. What if they started behaving the way real-life socialists behave? So for example, suppose Mickey Mouse says it's time to nationalize all the farmland here in the world of Disney. And when the peasants revolt and don't want the farmland to be nationalized, he just murders them. And there's a mass famine because it doesn't really work, and 5 million or 60 million people die. Imagine that they decide that intellectuals are public enemies, and so they just exterminate them the way that Pol Pot did in Cambodia, and 20% of the population gets killed. Imagine that there's massive economic stagnation because the 5-year economic plans that Minnie Mouse comes up with just don't work, to the point that over an 80-year period, the proletariat don't see any rise in the standard of living. Imagine they decide to punish all dissenters by throwing them in the gulags where they have to work to death, and many of them will chop off their own feet so they can die in the hospital rather than work in the mines. And the only people who prosper in these gulags, let's say, are a particular criminal group that preys upon priests and others, and they're considered friends of the Republic. Well, you probably wouldn't let your kids watch that show, right? But nevertheless, these are the behaviors we see in real-life socialist societies. So therefore, obviously, capitalism is obviously better than socialism. QED, we can be done. Now, if you're a socialist, you're like, that's not fair, that's not what I meant. And you're right, in a sense, because you're not, unless you're just really weird, you're not actually advocating this stuff. At least no socialists do anymore. In the past, they actually did, but no one does anymore. But what I'm making, the mistake in my argument, the problem with my argument here is exactly the same problem with Jerry Cohen's argument, and the problem with the argument that you make in your own head, and Adam Smith makes, and my mom makes, and your mom makes, where we're saying, we would be good if only we were good, we would be socialist. So here's what's going on with Jerry Cohen. What he's having you imagine is socialism plus perfect behavior is better than capitalism with realistic behavior. That's really his argument. He's saying socialism with morally perfect people is better than capitalism with real flawed people. Therefore, socialism is better than capitalism. But he's manipulating 2 variables at once in his argument. His socialist camping trip thought experiment manipulates 2 variables at once. One is the kind of economic system you have, and the other is the degree of moral virtue that he stipulates people to have. So this is not a really good argument, it's a bad argument, because what he needs to do is compare like to like. What would capitalism with perfect people be like compared to socialism with perfect people? Is there any reason to prefer one to the other? And what about capitalism and socialism with realistic people? To give you another illustration of this, imagine if I said, all right, which would you prefer to live under? Option A is Arendelle ruled by wise Queen Elsa once she gets that ice thing under control. And option B is the United States democracy ruled by like whichever politician you didn't vote for in the last election. All right, how many people say Queen Elsa? All right, a lot of you. So you all advocate monarchy. No, not really. You're like monarchy with like a really wise queen compared to like maybe average democracy. But I'm manipulating two things at once again, the virtue of the leader plus the kind of system it is. It's an unfair comparison. You want to compare like to like and manipulate one variable at once. So his argument is really flawed. The other problem with his argument, if you read the book, is that he often equates socialism with niceness. And I've seen this happen. Like I was giving a talk at something called the American Philosophical Association, and I described the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse Village, and a philosopher raised his hand and said, no, that's not capitalist. And I'm like, why not? He's like, because they're nice. He's like, niceness is by definition socialist, but that's not the right definition. Socialism is not love or kindness or oceans of lemonade. That's a real thing in socialist literature. Oceans of lemonade. It's not, so capitalism is not by definition greed or fearfulness. It's actually an open empirical question what these social systems do to us. And it turns out people study that question, and I can tell you what the answer is. People like Henrik and Paul Zak and Herbert Gintis, a number of other economists, have gone around the world doing experiments to see what predicts whether we are nice or mean. For example, if I have a game where you have the opportunity to cheat another person for significant amounts of money, will you cheat them or will you be trustworthy? If I have a game where you can trust other people and they can earn your trust, how will you act? If I give you a game where significant amounts of money are at stake and you have the opportunity to be unconditionally generous to a stranger, will you do so or will you be selfish? They've done this all around the world for large amounts of money, and what they find is the biggest cultural predictor in these games that you will be trusting, trustworthy, that you will be cooperative rather than cheating, and that you will be unconditionally generous is the extent to which you come from a market-based society. In fact, people who come from traditional and socialist societies are much worse in these games than people in market societies. Right? So empirically, it doesn't seem that markets actually exacerbate our vice despite the claim that they do. But nevertheless, Jerry Cohen won't be impressed because he's going to say, what's going on here is that Utopia would be socialist. Now I'm going to argue that he's wrong about that. In fact, Utopia would be capitalist, and here's why. So what do I mean by Utopia? What am I talking about? I want you to imagine a world like ours with the kind of resources we have, with people like us with the same abilities. We don't have superpowers, except for one thing. I take everybody's morality meter and I turn it up to 11. Everyone is perfectly virtuous. No one ever does anything wrong. Here's a question. What kind of institutions would that world have? Or another way to put it, if you want to put like a theological spin to it, say, because it's really kind of what's going on with Cohen too. If man had not fallen, what sort of institutions would we have? Would we be capitalist? Would we be socialist? Would we be something else? How would we know? That's the question. What would be a perfectly just society? A perfectly just society, what would it look like? So to show that Utopia is capitalist, you need to do two things. One is you have to give some explanation why even angels would want private property, specifically in the means of production. And second, you need to give some account of why they might want markets and economic freedom, even though they're angels. So that's what I'll do. So first I have to talk about property. What is a property right? When I say that I own this watch, like this is my watch, it's really a bundle of rights. What it means in particular, and the most central thing, is that there's this piece of the universe that I get to exclude the rest of the universe from. I can exclude all of you from interacting with this piece of the universe here. That's weird that we would have rights like that. It means that I'm allowed to modify the watch, sell it, rent it, destroy it. I could just bash it on stage right now. I won't because it's a nice watch, but I could. I could just give it to somebody. I won't, sorry. I could just toss it away. That's what ownership means. And also it means that you are not allowed to interact with it without my permission, and if you destroy it, you have to compensate me. That's what ownership is. Why would we want ownership of things? What would explain why we would want that in a utopian world? So we cannot use a lot of the standard economic arguments. The standard economic argument for private ownership works like this. If you make everything in common, if everyone owns everything collectively, everyone overuses it and destroys it, so you have to parcel and privatize to prevent something called the tragic commons. Great argument, irrelevant to utopia, because in utopia, everyone, being virtuous, would never overuse the commons, so that's not a worry. So we have to use more high-minded, highfalutin moral arguments. In particular, arguments I'm taking from socialists about why we should have private property and toothbrushes and clothes. Right? So here's what's going on. Like, we are not disembodied souls floating around the ether. Like, we're living in a material world, and I am a material guy. And that means that I need to interact with pieces of this material universe. For me, as a typical human being, my happiness in life requires that I have sustained projects that I engage in, things that I do over time that bring meaning to my life. That might mean writing a book on my computer, and I need to know that when I come back to that computer the next day, that someone else didn't mess it up and change all the words. It might mean having a collection of guitars and knowing that when I leave my amp set up the way that I want it, and someone's not going to come in there and mess with it. Right? It's really hard to dial in. It might mean that if you're a painter, having your own paintbrushes and things like that you can just leave the way that you want. And for what it's worth, Jerry Cohen, the socialist, completely agrees with this when it comes to things like your clothing and your hobbies. He says you should be allowed to own your own house as long as you don't rent it for income. You should be allowed to have your own car as long as you don't drive it for Uber. You should be able to have your own guitars as long as you don't make money off of them the way Van Halen does. I don't, so I'm okay. You can have these things, but you can't have private ownership in the means of production. What's so important about that? And here's where I ask people like Cohen to sympathize with the entrepreneurs and the business people. So I'd say to someone like Jerry Cohen, Cohen, when you'll be my Cohen if you don't mind. Cohen, when you sit down to write a paper, you, the arch socialist, you don't decide to have all of your papers written collectively by the entire philosophical community all at once. You want to write your paper the way that you want to write it. He'd be like, yeah, I'm not a socialist about paper writing. If you're an artist, you don't want to have every painting be painted by committee. All right, what should we paint? We're going to vote. Oh, horse won again. All right, what should we start? The first brush stroke? Oh, it won brown over here. Okay, next brush stroke. That would be horrible. It would make for a miserable life. They understand that when it comes to their own productive activities in art or in academia. But what about Willie the Giant? Willie the Giant doesn't just want to work on a farm, on the collective farm. He has a vision of how farming ought to go. And he wants to be able to have the freedom to experiment with running that vision on his own farm and seeing how it goes. Minnie doesn't just want to work on some bow factory making bows. She has a vision of how bow making should go, and she'd like to experiment with that vision. So I think in the same way that we want to be able to work as artists for ourselves, many of us want to work in business for ourselves and do that same kind of vision. We have a desire to be at home, to have a place that's our own, a niche that we can create and craft for ourselves. Right? So and they understand that when it comes to literal homes, but they just don't understand why you might think that when it comes to your work. But it does make sense for your work too. We also, having to ask permission all the time is in a sense oppressive. So for example, when my wife, I'm hardly ever at my house without someone else being there, but once in a while my wife and kids will leave and I'll be home by myself. And I'm like, freedom! Right? And it's not because oh, they're gone, now I can secretly do drugs or something. I don't do anything like that. I'm incredibly boring. All that happens when they leave is I turn up my amp really loud. That's about it. Right? But the reason I like it is because suddenly I don't have to ask permission for stuff. I can just do something I feel like doing without having to check with anybody. Now imagine everything were collectively held. You'd constantly be having to check permission with everything that you do. Right? So these are reasons why you might want private property, including in the means of production, even if we were all angels. But what about markets? Well, there's a number of reasons we want markets. One is because our choices define and determine who we are. And people understand this when it comes to civil liberties. So Jerry Cohen would say, you need to have the right to pick your own religion and pick what you're going to read and whom you're going to marry and how you're going to live, because that's defining who you are, and you should be the author of your own life. And then you say, well, what about economic decisions? Shouldn't we have that same right over economic decisions? When I'm choosing to invest in this or spend on this, I'm defining what my values are, I'm deciding who I'm going to be, I'm shaping my life according to my own vision. Now, in real-life capitalist worlds, they might say, I'm worried if I give people this much freedom, they're going to exploit and take advantage of each other. And it's true, they do. It's also true in real-life socialist worlds, they do that even more. But here in Utopia, you don't have to worry about that, because people, by hypothesis, are perfectly good and would never do that kind of thing. Further, there's another reason why people would want markets, even in Utopia, even if we were angels, and that's because markets are a way of getting people to work together on a mass scale. So we don't often recognize this, but even something as simple as a number 2 pencil, if you ask how many people work together to make that pencil, the answer is something like 50 million. It's a large number of people. It's not just the people at the pencil factory, it's all the people who made all the inputs that went into making the pencil, and the people who fed them, and the people who made the tools that made the tools that made the tools that made the pencil. All of them are involved in one way or another, and it works out that every time you use anything, something as simple as this or something as simple as a pencil, you're cooperating with untold millions of people whom you don't know. What coordinates our behavior together? How do we work together despite us not knowing one another? And the answer is Prices, basically. Prices. Market prices are information, and they tell us what to do. So imagine here, to illustrate why this is important for my argument, imagine I have a magic wand. When I wave this magic wand, it will make everybody 30 times richer, in the way that like the average American is 30 times richer than the average person living in the Americas 250 or 300 years ago. If I wave this magic wand, does that serve the common good? Jerry Cohen would say, yes, wave that magic wand. He's a materialist, let's make people rich. He would say, money is freedom. A $20 bill is a ticket to the world, and the more of that you have, the more freedom you have to do things. So he'd agree. But unfortunately, we don't have a magic wand. But imagine instead we had a wise philosopher queen, and she comes up with a plan, an economic plan. She says, I'll give everyone some options, I'm not going to force anyone to do anything. If you could either be let's say a mortician or a farmer, and if you could just be either an accountant or work in a microchip factory, and if you could either be an auto mechanic or a surgeon, you get to pick. If we all go along with my plan, we'll all become 30 times richer. It'll be like we wave that magic wand. Jerry Cohen, this Marxist, would say, if we were all perfectly good, we would want to go along with her plan. Alas, what economics tells us, unfortunately, is that no human being is smart enough to come up with that plan. There's something called the information problem of socialism, which means that central planning doesn't work. We're too dumb to make a plan for the entire economy all at once. And Jerry Cohen, to his credit, agrees that that's a problem. He agrees that socialism has this problem. So he advocates what he calls market socialism rather than real socialism. But unfortunately, that's not going to work. So we have to use markets. But here's the nice thing. What basic microeconomics is telling us is that us playing by the rules of supply and demand, us responding to the incentives prices create, allows us to work with people that we don't know, distant strangers around the world, and the result of that over time is if we wave that magic wand. In fact, we have waved it, and we're 30 times richer than we were 300 years ago. So if you care about other people like Mickey Mouse does, you're going to want to work in markets because you want people on the other side of the world, distant strangers you haven't met, to be better off. You'll know that by working in a market, you're contributing to their prosperity. There's one final argument, which is just which would you choose? So imagine you had the choice. All right? You can live in the socialist camping trip, or you can live in the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse village, but let's say with people rather than anthropomorphic animals. All right? How many of you would prefer to live in the socialist camping trip? How many of you would prefer to live in the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse village? All right, the overwhelming majority. Now, even when I've been at like the American Philosophical Association or like meetings where I have like a bunch of Marxists in front of me, interestingly, almost all of them pick the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse village over the socialist camping trip. Even they, right? Very few people would actually choose the socialist camping trip over the anarcho-capitalist Mickey Mouse Clubhouse village. So the majority of you would pick that over the other thing, which sounds like it means you think it's better. But in fact, that's a trick question. It's a trick question because capitalism doesn't make you choose, and that's why it's better. In fact, capitalism is really open-minded and tolerates socialism. For instance, does anyone here live in a commune? No? I do. I live in a commune with 4 people. Right? You do. You live in a commune, right? A lot of you live in communes. Your family is a little mini commune surrounded by it's a sea of communes surrounded by the capitalist waters. Right, that's what capitalism is. The Mickey Mouse Clubhouse doesn't have a rule that you have to be capitalist. If the Smurfs decide to come in and have a commune, the Smurfs are communists, by the way. They are. Like Papa Smurf looks like Karl Marx. That's on purpose. That's why he wears red. So if the Smurfs come on and have a commune, the other villagers aren't like, no, you have to have a joint stock company. They don't care about it. They're like, that's fine. Do whatever you want to do, as long as you'll also tolerate Minnie Mouse having her own shop. So capitalism allows you to be socialist. And this is a problem because really when you ask people, what is utopia? Throughout the history of philosophy, as people talk about utopianism, they have a central problem. Everyone comes up with a beautiful vision of what they think utopia is, and it's always one thing. And that's a mistake because there's a lot of diversity among us. Your utopia and my utopia are different. My utopia might be like a less congested version of Northern Virginia, maybe with less humidity, where we all race our like sports cars around all day and then go to heavy metal concerts at night. That's a perfect society in my view. Your perfect society might be a small communal fishing village where everyone shares a common faith. Your vision of society might be like, one of those cool hipster villages in New York City. Your idea might be something else. Our visions of utopia are different. What's interesting about this is that Jerry Cohen's first major book, the thing that really made him as a philosopher, was a critique of the libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick. And Nozick, in the book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, says, the problem with utopian theorizing is that people have so much diversity that there's no such thing as one utopia for all of us. Rather, each of us has a different utopia. And what we want is a super system in which people can set up different kinds of communities, and you can choose which kind of community that you live with. So Nozick says, well, really utopia is like a libertarian superstructure that allows other kinds of non-libertarian societies within it that people choose to live by choice, including communes and non-communes. So in a sense, what Cohen has done is he's offered us the equivalent of the Mona Lisa as a vision of utopia, and the libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick has, in a sense, offered us the entire Louvre, right? The Mona Lisa and everything else. And so that's why capitalism is, in a sense, better. The reason capitalism is better is because for some people, socialism is better. So in conclusion, Cohen is right, and you're right when you have that worry about capitalism being unsavory. Ideal socialism is, in a sense, better than realistic capitalism, granted. But if we expand our comparison out, ideal socialism or ideal capitalism is better than ideal socialism, and oddly, one reason it's better is because for some people it's not. And realistic capitalism is better than realistic socialism. So in a sense, capitalism beats socialism regardless of whether you're doing utopian theorizing or practical in the dirt, on the ground economic theorizing. Either way, it wins. So in the real world, capitalism incentivizes entrepreneurs to come up with things that you want at prices that you can afford to pay. In an ideal world, it does even better because it gives you the opportunity to craft your own personal utopia. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll take your comments, questions, and objections. So by the way, I teach mixed political science, economics, and philosophy classes, and so for me, a very common type of question is, here's 6 reasons why you're wrong. I'm okay with that. You can go for it. Right? What do you think? So we have mics back there. I guess they want people to use. I don't know what they were going to do for people up in front, but they probably have some plan. Yeah.
Don't need the mic. Okay. You're walking out of my question. Okay. So, Jesus was a socialist. That's a pretty easy argument to make. I want you to defend this argument. Jesus was a capitalist.
Okay. So this is the argument for that, I think, right? If we were not, what does it mean? What's going on in the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse Village that Jesus would have a problem with? I don't see anything. In fact, just to be fair to the show, the character Pete is sometimes an antagonist, though never as himself, always as a different version of Pete. And that's there to teach moral lessons to kids, but you could write that out with no problem, right? So you have a society that fully realizes everything that Jesus wants us to do, and it's anarcho-capitalist, and it's the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse Village. Right? So I think when people read the Bible and they're like, I'm going to read a lot of politics into the Bible, I don't think there's that much stuff there to really know. So this is the argument for, yeah, Jesus would, Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, that's what he would want. In a sense, Cohen is really asking a theological question. What would society be like if people had not fallen but you weren't living in a Garden of Eden? What would they live like? And he thinks it'd be the socialist camping trip. I think it would be this. All right, so yeah, it's a good question. And I think there is a theological underpinning to like this worry of his. Very good. All right. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the great talk and the great book. And I really do feel much better equipped at defending capitalism. But there's still one question that I'd love to get your take on. Now, I see this as kind of the fundamental issue that socialism is trying to address, and that is, forgive my cynicism here, but it seems like socialists are responding to the problem that people don't like having less than the people that are around them.
Yeah.
And it makes them feel bad when they look around and other people are doing more well off. And socialism is, maybe I'm mischaracterizing socialism, but it seems like that's really at the heart of what it's trying to solve.
Yeah.
Do you have a capitalist solution to that problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a question about how egalitarian is a society going to be and why. In a sense, I've just remained neutral on it. As far as the book goes, I'm agnostic. I'm like, however equal you think they should be, they're that equal, but they get it without having to be socialist. They can do it voluntarily. I have too much, you have too little, I'll give you more. But there is a question about why we want equality. So here's I'm going to go beyond what the book says. I think many times certain arguments for economic equality are based upon a mistake. They're really not about equality per se, they're about poverty. The problem is some people don't have enough, not that they have more. So the real issue from a justice standpoint is making sure everybody has enough. Now Cohen disagrees. Cohen is a radical, hardcore egalitarian. But here's his argument for equality. I don't think it's a very good one. He says, the problem is, if I have more than you, you and I cannot fully be in community with one another. And he says, imagine, this is a real example. He says, imagine that we are about to place a bet. We're going to flip a coin. We each have $100. We're going to flip a coin. If it comes up heads, I give you 50. If it comes up tails, you give me 50. We flip the coin. You win $50. You're now $100 richer than I am. And we both think it was a good bet, and we'd be willing to do it again. Actually, it's a bummer that I lost, and you're happy that you won. He says, we can't even allow that. Even $100 difference would create too much difference between us. So now we can't fundamentally understand each other and empathize with each other. He gives this example where he says, imagine I take the bus because my car's in the shop, and I take the bus and I never drive the bus. And when I'm there, I'm like, man, taking the bus stinks. And I say that to the people who ride the bus every day. Well, they're not going to empathize with me, and I can't really empathize vice versa because we're too different from one another. So how much money creates this horrible difference where we're not in community? Cohen says $100. But if he really thinks that, if $100 difference would do it, then surely you being Catholic and me being Protestant, or you being Muslim and me being Christian, or you being into country and me being into heavy metal, or you being just different, or you being different race from me or different ethnicity, or just having a different vision of the good life, surely that's going to be even worse than $100 difference. So my worry is that the arguments that they give to try to get for strict equality imply that we should have no differences at all. And Cohen doesn't want to say that. He doesn't want to say we should all be the Borg and everyone should be assimilated. He says there should be diversity. But if diversity of religion is allowed, sure there can be diversity of money too. So I just think at the end of the day, his arguments for equality are not very good. And so I think that's a worry. He does not want to get into the argument that the reason we should be equal is because I'm really envious of others who are different. He doesn't want to lionize envy. It has to be a kind of moral argument. Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. This is something of a meta question. So you're speaking to defend capitalism from its critics, and there seem to be a lot of critics within capitalism who have benefited tremendously from the system, and yet they still look to socialism, even though this guy Jerry Cohen is living in a capitalist society. I'm wondering if you think there's any deeper reason for why people who benefit from capitalism are still promoting socialism, or if this is just an intellectual disagreement.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons. So in my day job, I work on voter behavior. That's my main thing. Right? This is the main thing I work on is why people have the political beliefs they have, and it's really kind of depressing. So part of it is, think of it this way. Imagine you were in a class this large with this many people. A lot of people left in the back, but when it was still full, right? You had 1,000 people, and the professor says at the beginning of the semester, you're going to have a final exam 15 weeks from now, and instead of you getting, it'll be worth 100% of your grade, but instead of you getting your own personal grade on the final exam, I'm going to average all of your grades together and everyone will get exactly the same grade. How hard would you study? You're laughing, right? You wouldn't study. The average grade would be an F. So something like this happens when it comes to politics. Unfortunately, our votes don't count for very much. How many of you are from Idaho? Right? Okay. So on the most optimistic projection, you had something like a 1 in a billion chance of being decisive in the last presidential election. All right. I'm from Northern Virginia, so my vote was a little bit worth a little more. I had a 1 in 100 million chance, but yours was about a 1 in a billion, and that's on the optimistic projection. The other ones say it's worse. So your votes don't count for very much, so your political beliefs are not about tracking the world and tracking the truth. What we use our political beliefs for fundamentally is to form coalitions with other people. When I form political beliefs, that's me waving a flag to say to some people, you should be my friends and we're enemies with them. So I don't think people's political beliefs are particularly rational for that reason. There's also this worry that when we think about what markets are for, the arguments that economists give for markets are fundamentally about selfishness. Markets are good because they get selfish people to work together, which makes it sound like markets are kind of nasty. Right? They work, but they work for bad, unsavory reasons. So there's that. There's one other issue. This is like a very long-winded answer to your question, but the great economist Milton Friedman, who won a Nobel laureate, I think in 1977, said, we have to protect capitalism from the capitalists. All right? And Adam Smith said the same thing. He said, scarcely can we get two business people in a room together without them conspiring to undermine the public interest. So what they're saying, and this is a whole field of economics called public choice, is that the people, the capitalists themselves, the people who own the means of production, they know they can rig the rules of the game to disadvantage competitors and benefit themselves. So they might try to, for example, push to get subsidies or push to get a regulation that hurts their competitors and helps them. So they benefit from being in a capitalist society, but they also benefit from being in a capitalist society where the rules are rigged in their favor. Call that crony capitalism. I think the combination of those three things help explain all of that. I think your question. Good question.
What about like a type of market utopian socialism in which there's communally owned means of production and the profit generated from that's used to, is redistributed equally across the society in the form of a basic income, and then like there is private ownership of other property, just not the direct, like just not actual capital?
Yeah. In a sense, that's what Cohen ends up advocating. Because of the information problem of socialism, he says we can't have real pure socialism. The best we can have is what you just said, although without the also in addition, we'll have some purely private firms. But from the utopian standpoint, that's totally fine. Like let people do that in some communities, but in other communities they're going to do something different, and that's fine as well. So it's like, yeah, that's a good thing, but it's not required. So I think, like I said, like what Utopia includes. The nice thing about my vision of Utopia, or really Nozick's vision of Utopia, is that it includes Cohen's Utopia within it, right? In the same way that like the United States contains Boise, right? So yeah, some societies will do that and others won't. It's not required. So what Cohen would have to say is, do I have a reason to say that's the only thing that they're allowed to do? And his complaints about capitalism just don't apply under utopian conditions. And if we stop talking about utopian conditions, we start talking about like, what do we do in the real world? He actually admits, well, capitalism works better there. That's a good question.
Makes me uncomfortable. It seems that a lot of the criticism about capitalism is tied to recent history with Wall Street and bailouts. My question to you is that the failing of capitalism, and how capitalistic are the American markets actually?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let's see, needs to zip back a bunch of, all the way to that map near the beginning. All right, so the Fraser Institute does this ranking of economic freedom, and the US moved up a little bit. Actually, it didn't really move up, the other ones just moved down a little bit. For most of the 2010s, the US was ranked like 18 out of 186. So even Denmark and Norway and Finland, which we often call socialist here, were ranked higher. And the reason for that is that we're not like this radically free market society. We have lots of cronyism throughout our history. We've had it like, you know, Abe Lincoln was a massive cronyist, really. Like people we extol as great presidents, they were. Whenever you have a government that has the power to regulate the economy, as the great economist Jim Buchanan said, people are going to compete to win favors. Like the power to do good is also the power to distribute favors, and once you have that power, people are going to compete to win those favors. And who does it? Companies like Archer Daniels Midland, and they do it a lot. Now, what some people say is, oh, we just have to have a constitutional constraint that forbids the government from doing that. But realistically, that's impossible, because once you create that constraint, they're going to chip away at it and revise it over time. Every capitalist society will have some degree of cronyism. And why some have more and others have less is not well understood. So for example, economists, they've been studying like which institutions make countries prosperous and which don't. And one thing that we know is that certain institutions work better when there's a phenomenon called generalized social trust. And some societies like New Zealand and Sweden have very high levels of generalized social trust. Other societies like the United States have moderate levels. And other countries like Russia have really low levels of generalized social trust. And we know that when you have low levels of social trust, people will rig the game and take advantage of the system more and do more rent seeking and so on. So we can say that that particular empirical phenomenon leads to that problem, but no one knows how to increase social trust and make there be more of it. So yeah, I think it is built into capitalism that you will, like realistically in a real capitalist society, you will have cronyism. There's not much we can do to avoid that. We can nip away at a little bit here and there, but it's always going to happen. And throughout the US history, it's been cronyist. Like Hamilton, anyone ever see the play Hamilton? Like, read Hamilton's actual intellectual work. That guy was a hardcore cronyist, like, you know, so it's been there forever. Good question.
So it kind of sounds like the questions that we've been hearing kind of has to deal with the question of greed. Does capitalism allow greed to take advantage of the system? And if so, how can we keep that in check?
Yeah, right. So if we're talking about utopia, you know, they don't have any bad levels of greed. Whatever the proper amount of greed is, by hypothesis, they have that. In the real world, people are greedy. People are fairly selfish. Even a lot of charitable giving is really about signaling to others you're a good person. If you want to read a good book on this, the book's coming out in February called The Elephant in the Brain, and it's all about that point. So I think what we want to do in the real world is try to channel people's greed to publicly spirited ends as much as we can. And this is why capitalism seems to work. People are pretty greedy, but the way you get rich in a well-regulated capitalist economy is something like you come up with things other people want that they can pay for, right? In other types of societies, the way that your greed worked was through predation, by taking what they have from them. So that's the best we can do. Is we have great greed's there, we can't really change it. Let's just try to channel it to publicly spirited ends as best we can.
So this is sort of a relevant question. I know that you have a book that's called Against Democracy, which flirts with the idea that due to the fact that there's, in some countries or some societies, uninformed electorates, that it may lead to societies that don't respect, I don't know, positive market forces or ideas or even respect to individual liberty. And the reason that capitalism is praised so much is because the voting power is in the consumer with their dollar vote. So if there's an uninformed market, how do you reconcile the existence and the positive utility that can come from capitalism?
Yeah, very good. So, by the way, that book is not about, I didn't write that book as a critique of elections because it's, you know, societies aren't sufficiently libertarian. If I took a pill and became like a hardcore left-wing person, that book would have stayed exactly the same. It's really not like in any way market-oriented. It's very ideologically neutral in that sense. But you're asking a good question about, so I have a worry about voting behavior, which is that people tend to be ignorant and irrational, and when you aggregate their preferences, you don't get emergent wisdom. But you do get that in markets, so is there a difference there? And the answer is yeah, and it's because the incentive system works differently. You as a private consumer, here's like a good way of thinking about markets. People are pretty dumb, but you make private decisions and you have a lot of unilateral power over yourself. So when you make a dumb decision, you get punished, and when you make a smart decision, you get rewarded. If there's like a new burrito restaurant downtown, and you go there, you spend $10, you eat the burrito, and it's disgusting, you learn, like that's the market punishing you, and you learn not to go back. If it's wonderful, you go back. If you have the idea of like, I don't know, maybe if I take MacBook Pros and I smash them together and make a sculpture of myself, I can make a lot of money, and you spend $100,000 doing that, and then no one buys your sculpture, you bear the loss, and you learn over time to behave better. So think of markets as a system where people get punished for their stupidity and rewarded for their smarts, and over time they improve. And they're not perfect at that. There's long-term decisions like, you know, saving for your retirement. They're not so good at that. But nevertheless, people have a lot of unilateral power over themselves, and that's what happens. Democracy is not a market. Democracy is a commons. It's a commons because your individual voting doesn't matter, mine doesn't matter, your vote doesn't matter, your vote doesn't matter. All that matters is how we vote. And so because of that, individual decision-making is not smart decision-making is not rewarded, individual bad decision-making is not punished. You as an individual decide whether to consume information and process it rationally, but the cost to you are going to exceed the benefits of doing so. And that happens to all of us, so it just works differently. You know, democracy is a commons, markets are markets.
Today is the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. And so I'd like to focus for a moment on Vladimir Lenin and George III. One of the reasons I personally am skeptical of socialism is the fear of dictatorships. And similarly, some of the reasons in September of 1787 for our Constitution was the fear of a monarch and concentrated power. And so my question to you is, are these concerns outside the realm of what you do? Are they just not economic factors? And if they are, explain how they are.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good. So we have to ask a question. What kind of theorizing are we doing? Jerry Cohen and many philosophers have this view that one of the things we ought to do is figure out what a perfectly just society would be like. It's not the only question, maybe it's not even the most important question, but it's a question. If you're asking that question, then you have to suppose that everyone in that society does the right thing all the time. So in Utopia, you don't have to worry about socialist dictators because by hypothesis, that's unjust and they're not going to do it. Now, in the real world, if we're asking what institutions should we have with realistic people like us, then of course we have to take that into account. And so Cohen himself would admit, when we concentrate power that much, what we get are people like Stalin and others who will use that power for bad ends rather than for good ends. So you have to just ask the question, are you trying to come up with a count of what an ideal is, in which case you can imagine away human depravity? Or are you asking, what should we do in the real world, in which case you have to pay a lot of attention to human depravity? Right, so it just depends on which question you're asking. So yeah, realistically, of course, that's a major problem. And Cohen, to his credit, my socialist interlocutor here, he admits that problem.
So the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse example exists in a utopia. So what's your opinion on anarcho-capitalism or laissez-faire capitalism in a realistic society?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not here to take a strong stand on exactly which sets of institutions we have, but I think the question of anarchism in particular, I think of it as a good research question. How to put it, we often make certain assumptions about why we need the state, which might not be well-founded. So people will say things like, people will underprovide for public goods unless we have state enforcement of that monopoly. Though it's a weird argument because the state is itself a public good, so they'll probably underprovide that too. But in fact, there are these things called dominant assurance contracts which seem like they can solve the problem without requiring a state. So maybe that argument doesn't work. Is it enough to work in the real world? I think it's an open research question. People are more cooperative than we give them credit for. A good way to illustrate that is how many of you have heard of the prisoner's dilemma? All right, almost everybody. So microeconomics seems to predict that everyone will cheat in the prisoner's dilemma. And in reality, people are very cooperative. Right? So I think a lot of the arguments we give for why we must have the state are not quite as strong as we think. And there are a number of people, there's a guy named Peter Leeson who wrote a book called Anarchy Unbound, Why Anarchy Works Better Than You Think, which goes through and talks about how certain forms of anarchism are more successful than you give them credit for. There's another book by Edward Stringham called Private Governance, and it's all about how most of our interactions in society, together, are not even potentially regulated by the state. So for example, if I go to shop at your restaurant and you rip me off for $25, I'm not going to call the cops and I'm not going to sue you. And the reason is because the cost of suing you and calling the cops is higher than the benefit I would get from recovering. So if you were a really selfish person, you would know that and you would just take advantage of me. But in reality, people don't. So you have all these things where there cannot actually be enforcement, neither private nor public enforcement, where people don't take advantage of each other. And there are other cases where they use private enforcement and social mechanisms rather than government. So I think these kinds of research questions are showing that a lot of the arguments that we have for why we must have a government rely upon an overly pessimistic view of human nature. Is that enough to show that we could, as real human beings with our real flaws, dispense with government, be anarchist? I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think it's something we should keep looking into. We shouldn't rest that we're at the end of history. We should be looking for ways to improve upon what we have.
So this might be too general of a question, but what is your personal opinion or perspective on taxation?
Taxation. Yeah, that's a really big question. Assuming we need to have some sort of government, assuming that the government's justified, then we need to have some sort of taxation for it, probably. And if it's not, then we don't. I mean, I'm not ready to say anarchy will for sure work. So we should have some forms of taxes, let's suppose, and they should ideally be, I don't know, relatively fair, relatively widespread, ideally not too distortionary for the economy. So that's one reason to have, say, sales taxes or value, VAP taxes rather than income taxes. I'm pretty conventional when it comes to that kind of stuff. So whatever your standard microeconomics is, I'm not going to say much different from that. I would say though, here's one thing that's worth pointing out. A lot of people who are on the left in the U.S. say, your average kind of left Democrat in the U.S., I don't know what your politics are, they go, we need to tax the rich more and because they don't pay their fair share. And empirically speaking, we actually have a very progressive tax rate in the U.S. It's very progressive compared to those other countries in Europe. The overall level of taxation is fairly low compared to Europe, but it's very progressive. The gap between what the rich pay and the poor pay is pretty high. It's to the point where, like, when it comes to income tax, the top 3% pay something like 95% of all income taxes. If you want a European-style welfare state, you're going to need to have a European-style tax system, which means, contrary to what Bernie and Hillary will say, you need to tax the middle class and the poor much more. That's how they do it. They tax everybody, including the low-income earners, at a very high rate, and then they redistribute it back to them through government services. All right, so I would say, if you are on the left and you want those sort of societies, like the free market welfare states of Europe, then you're going to need to have their tax system. You can't have our tax system. It doesn't generate enough money to pay for that. All right, where are we? All right, we have a couple minutes. So next question, yeah.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the lecture. I think it was both engaging and informative.
Thanks.
But my question is, do you think economic systems affect culture or perhaps zeitgeist? And if so, what is the extent of their influence?
Yeah, do economic systems affect culture? I think they do, and in some ways, very positive ways. So one reason they do is because of trade. So here's something to note. When you think about the cultural centers of the United States, which cities would you pick? Would you say Boise? No offense. New York. You think New York, right? Where else? San Francisco, LA. That's where American culture gets made, right? You mean Nashville too, right? These are places, one thing to note about all these places is that they're places where you have high levels of immigration and lots of new ideas coming together. And a really good book to read about this is by the economist Tyler Cowen called Creative Destruction. His thesis is that what you think of as native culture is in almost every case a synthesis of past ideas. People taking something from over here and something over here and putting it together. Indian food and tomato soup, let's make chicken tikka masala and it's great. Right? And that everything you think of as authentic is really a past synthesis. And when you have places with lots of new ideas coming in, it's easier to synthesize these kinds of things. And so that's why you see throughout history, the places that have significant amounts of trade are places that are also the cultural innovators. That's why when you think of ancient Greek, where did the culture come from in ancient Greece that we're still reading today, it's more Athens than Sparta, right? Because of that kind of phenomenon. Further, a good illustration of this is what do you think is what do real Americans listen to? Country music. Where does country music come from? What are some of the instruments they use in country music? Banjo, right? That's a weird word. Where does the banjo come from? West Africa. It's a Western African instrument reconstructed in the United States. They play guitar. That's a weird word. That comes from Spain through Persia, right? For those of you who know music theory, the most common chord progression in country music is, it's a little bit more, one version of that. It goes 1 5 5 1 5 5 1 1 4 5 1. Right, so you got it at the end, right? That comes from Africa. So where does country music come from? It's a fusion of European folk music and African folk music, European folk instruments, Middle Eastern folk instruments, and African folk instruments. That's real American music, right? Jazz, same thing. It's a little bit more obvious with jazz maybe, but even country is like that. Also, I think it has an immediate effect. Trade has this effect on our tolerance for one another. So Voltaire wrote this thing called Letters on England back in the early 1700s. And I'm not going to get the quotation exactly right, so sorry about that. But he says something like, if you go to the London Stock Exchange, you'll see the Muslim and the Christian and the Jew all hanging out together. And there, they only use the word infidel to refer to the person who refuses to pay his debts and doesn't keep his word. Right? And then they all get along, and then they go home, some to pray in the synagogue, and some to pray in the church, and some to do something else, but they get along. And this is called the I don't speak French well, the do commerce thesis. It's something like getting people to trade together makes them more tolerant. The idea is let's say I'm Christian and you're Muslim, and you have some spices and I have some wool, and you think I'm an infidel and I think you're an infidel, but I kind of want what you have and you want what I have. So we hold our noses and we trade. And we keep doing that, and over time we meet each other, we interact, and you're you're not so bad, and you're not so bad. And over time you have higher levels of tolerance. And so you see attitudes of tolerating difference and appreciating difference arise in trade-centric countries, and countries that withdraw from trade, you see the opposite of here. So I think markets have many of these ameliorative effects on us, and maybe that's what explains why, empirically speaking, when we actually go to look at the countries that are nicest, where was my slide on that? Niceness is correlated with markets, positively correlated with. Corruption is lower in market-based societies than non-market-based societies. The desire to give is, so there's the corruption one. the generosity is positively correlated with market-based societies. Even once you control for income, you still see more unconditional generosity in market-based societies. I think it's markets, in fact, have an ameliorative effect on us. Right? Even it turns out there are experiments that people do where you get strangers working together and you introduce coinage with the strangers and they start cooperating even more. Right? Something about coin signals, oh, now we can trust each other. Now, you do it with like people who know each other very closely and money separates them, but with strangers it brings them together. Yeah, so Cohen, like, this is one of my beefs with him. He's like, markets exacerbate selfishness. And I'm like, Cohen, if you got off your armchair and looked around, there's actually, you can, instead of doing this philosophically, you can study the world. People have done it and they get the opposite finding. So he never looked into it. Okay. All right, I think you're the last one. Is there anyone else? Yeah, you're good?
Thank you for your time. I had a question about, do you think that the military could be more capitalistic, and how far do you think that could go?
What do you mean by the military being more capitalistic?
It's funded through the taxpayer right now, and it's a very large budget, and I feel like that kind of socialist structure impedes the rest of society from being more capitalistic.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know. The best book, I think, to read on that particular question was by my dissertation supervisor, David Schmitz. He wrote a book called The Limits of, I actually can't remember the name of the title. This is embarrassing as my advisor. I know the subtitle was an essay on the public goods question, but I can't remember the main title. It was published in like 1991. And he talks about, like, is it possible to fund the military through something called dominant assurance contracts, which I mentioned before a second ago. And I can't remember what he says about it. He did all these experiments. He tries to extrapolate what that means. So send me an email and I'll send you the citation, right? But that's like the best literature I know on that particular question. Yeah, well, you know, when Milton Friedman was pushing, when Milton Friedman back in the 70s and a number of other by the way, economists are responsible for there not being a draft. It's really like 24 economists made that happen. And when they were pushing for that, a number of generals said, no, we have to have a draft, because if we have an all-volunteer army, then we're going to have a bunch of mercenaries working for us because they're working for pay. And then Milton Friedman said, yes, they're working for pay and they're mercenaries, and I am a mercenary professor, and that is a mercenary car mechanic, and that's a mercenary teacher, and that's a mercenary doctor, and that's a mercenary priest. So if that's okay with them, let's have mercenary armies too. What's his response? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for speaking. It was excellent. Okay, so your book is titled Why Not Capitalism, but there's some ambiguity there, because by capitalism you could refer to the Mickey Mouse Club, which is like anarcho-capitalism, but at least according to the Fraser Institute map, you could also be referring to Norway, which is, has a lot of redistribution. So at what point is a capitalist economy no longer a capitalist economy? Is it just when there's no private property? Can it tolerate any level of redistribution on top of that?
Yeah, that's a good question about definitions, and I'm inclined to punt and give it to the Fraser Institute and let them use their rankings. And there's a question about how you mix this together. So I think the difference between capitalist and socialist, or capitalist and non-capitalist, is like the difference between having a full head of hair and being bald. Like the boundary is fuzzy, like literally fuzzy in that case. It's not a fine distinction. It's not like married or unmarried. It's like you can kind of gradually become one or the other. And so what they end up doing is they rate countries on a bunch of different things. They'll say things like, how much labor freedom do you have? How easy is it to start a business? What's your level of taxation? How many nationalized industries do you have? How easy is it to trade with people in other countries? How much regulation are you subject to? How sound is your money? How well is your private property protected from appropriation from the central government, and so on. And then they give everything a ranking, and they kind of mix this together. So this is why Denmark will do better than the US most of the time. Denmark gets dinged for having a very high level of taxation, so their score in that is really low. But then on everything else, like business freedom, labor freedom, trade freedom, sound money, et cetera, they're actually higher. They get a higher ranking than the US. And there's a question about how we average that together and whether their averaging is fair. But I would just say the more that you have, the more capitalistic you are, and the less you have, the less capitalistic you are. But there's certainly not a point where you can go, now you're definitely not capitalist. It's like, we know there's a distinction between certain things, but there's no fine line between them. We just gradually become, so there's these problematic middle cases. So a lot of those countries like Brazil, I've been to Brazil. there's shops everywhere and all sorts of private ownership, right? But they also have lots of nationalized industries and the government controls things. So they're a yellow. They're kind of in between, you know? And then there's countries that have that are red and are even more socialistic, but even they have markets. And there aren't really a lot of examples of pure socialism or pure capitalism out there. We just have all these mixed economies. But it's worth noting in general, the bluer ones are the nicer ones. Okay. Is that everybody? All right, well, thanks very much for being out here. I appreciate it.